I mean, we did stop at times to get gas and things like that, but no. Yeah. I think it was the last, maybe the last hour, I just couldn't do it anymore. My wife took over for a while,
Oh no.
you know? So, but I get really tired, I start falling asleep at the wheel. Years ago, I used to work in one part of New Jersey, down near you, and I used to travel further north to get to the other job, and I was sleeping on my way during rush hour.
Been there.
Up the Parkway.
Oh, yeah.
During rush hour.
Yeah. Been there.
I remember one time I was actually falling asleep. I was at a toll booth. I was reaching the toll booth. I was dozing off, approaching the toll booth. It was pouring rain. I had the windows down and the music blasting. And I almost hit the gate at the toll booth. Yeah. I was that tired. But I think at that point I had I was running off of about 36 hours. You know what I mean? So you know, things happen. Hopefully nothing dangerous. I'll say it that way. Okay. But I want you to realize that this system is supposed to keep you alert and awake. Okay? Based on what's going on, the senses that are going on, maybe the motor functions, okay? So I want you to realize, okay? All right, so let's go to the cerebellum. Apparently this is going to go to the cerebellum. Why? Because the cerebellum's involved in muscle coordination. I do want you to realize in most animals, the cerebellum is the largest part of the brain. Anybody have a pet? Dog, cat, chinchilla?
Yeah.
Tiger? You have a
I
tiger?
wish.
Okay, I want to make sure, you know.
I have a cat who thinks he's a tiger.
Yeah, well, that's fine, you know, that's how they are sometimes. But I do want you to realize when we do the dissection of the brain, which is going to be a sheep brain, you'll notice how much larger the cerebellum is in comparison to the cerebrum, okay? And I want you to realize that the main reason is because that portion is involved with muscle movements. It does have two hemispheres, just like your cerebrum, okay? So it is divided that way, but, you know, you do actually have it coordinating muscles. One of the things you'll notice, which is interesting, it does also have part of the muscle activity is helpful for the equilibrium. In other words, related to how the balance is actually affected. Okay. I want you to think about this. You guys probably don't even think about it now because it's been so long ago. But when you were young, they probably did some sort of thing with posture.
Oh, like when you were young?
When you're really young. No, before that.
Huh?
I'm talking about when you were in elementary school, they tried to teach you how to stand straight, sit up straight, those kinds of things. Remember, that's all related to muscles. And try to coordinate those muscles so that you actually have recognition of what you're doing with that. Over time, most of us then do other things, like you guys might notice you hunch over your desk and it causes curvatures that you don't expect, or other things that happen. Okay? But your cerebellum is actually the portion that's actually coordinating it. One of the things that we will also see is that when we look at it, you'll notice that, and I want you to look at the image real quickly. And you'll notice there's gray matter on the outside and white matter on the inside. The white matter is actually known as the arbor vitae. Why? Because it looks like a tree. That's what the definition, the Latin is. Arbor is plant, vitae, life.
And on an autopsy, when you have more gray matter than white matter, that's a sign of Alzheimer's, right? Because they really can't diagnose
Yeah,
Alzheimer's.
Yeah, but we're not talking about the cerebellum. It could be in other parts, okay? The cerebrum. That's where you're really talking about, okay? When we look at the cerebellum, it does have pellicles, which is basically where we actually get sensory messages and motor messages. I want you to realize that's what's going on. So we have some coming from the spinal cord, which are sensory. We have some that's coming from the cortex, the cerebral cortex, and the basal ganglia. Basal ganglia is rather important also. We're going to talk about that. Basal ganglia, I'm going to talk about that a couple more times. Like, for instance, when we talked about rabies, basal ganglia infected. Okay, so I want you to realize. Or syphilis, that's where it actually affects. And we also have motor aspects that are coming from the superior portions, from the motor messages. Any questions about the cerebellum? Which gets us to our diencephalon, and that's where the diencephalon looks like. This is one view. This is basically an anterior view on a frontal or a coronal section. When we're looking at our brain up here, where are we looking at it? We're basically looking at it in this area, okay? So I want you to kind of get an idea that it's in this area. It's not hard to see it from here, but I do want you to realize that that's what we're seeing. Here's another view that may actually give you another view of where it is. Actually, this one will give you a comparison of the two views so that you can actually see it. Okay, so you've got the lateral view and then you have the anterior view. Okay, and we're going to talk about some of these parts. That's why I want you to notice this. You'll notice some things that you may actually notice. For instance, one of the parts is known as thalamus. We also have the hypothalamus. I'm trying to see that on this. This is not really showing it exactly, but it would be right below the thalamus, right down here. So we're looking, here's the thalamus, okay? But the hypothalamus would be below it, right just down here. Okay, so we're going to be looking at bolts, and here's your two lateral ventricles, so you have an idea where that is, and our third ventricle is here. Okay? Just to give you insight of where we're talking about. Some of these steps. Okay. Make sense so far? He's playing with it. Don't ask me.
No, I'm just thinking at it.
Yeah. He's just a friend for her. Okay? So a couple things that we're also going to see in this. We're going to talk about some sections that are not the major portions. Like, you might notice that we're going to talk about the thalamus and hypothalamus. And there's also subcategories of parts that we're going to see. So I want you to realize that. But when we look at the thalamus, basically this is where we see it. It's, of course, superior to the midbrain. We have sensory. We also have, which are going to eventually lead up to the cerebrum. The only one that's not a sensory message that comes through the thalamus is olfactory, or smell.
So the only sensory that doesn't.
Does not, yeah, is smell, okay? You'll actually notice that there are 7 groupings. They're listed up there, okay? You will also notice that you actually identify pain, temperature, and light touch and pressure in the thalamus. So essentially what we're looking at is a lot of it is related to cognition. Your awareness of these different senses. Your thalamus, or the diencephalon in particular, is a lot related to our homeostasis, controlling our abilities to maintain that balance. So that's why we actually see things like the senses. Your thalamus, if you're looking at it, it's about an inch long, and it relays messages. It relays sensory to our cerebrum. It also has a lot of the crude perception. What does that mean? You identified something. You touched it. Okay? Your senses are there. They touched it. They sent the message. It goes to the thalamus. It has an awareness that something was touched. What was it? Well, then it has to go to the cerebrum to actually identify what that really means. Okay? You picked up that nice, lovely, hot pan. And you dropped it. Thalamus identified you touched something, it was hot, but you don't know the details. The cerebrum coordinates and actually identifies from past experiences what that was. Okay? So the thalamus is actually getting those crude concepts of what it was, basically. All right? Also, well, this is where your brain can pull apart. Can you guys pull your brain apart?
I mean, if you're unalive, maybe.
Oh, come on, guys. Don't you have a brain that you can pop apart? Like this one?
I
Watch.
know it's checked for me.
Isn't this a lovely brain? Let's pull this apart. You guys are just watching it. Oh, wow, look at that. Right here.
Yeah.
This is why I want to show this. This is your thalamus. Right here. Okay? And that's why it's important to have some sort of concept of it. That's why I want to make sure you guys can pull it apart and see. Because when we're looking at it, a lot of times the thalamus will actually have the different nuclei which are colorized in this image. Okay? Where they relay different messages, sensory messages. Okay? Including both things that are going out to the cerebellum or the basal ganglia. A lot of your anterior nucleus is involved with emotions, memories, and knowledge or cognition. All right. Your hypothalamus, which is below it, you'll notice that there are 4 major regions. Okay. You'll notice the names mammillary, tubular, supraoptic, and preoptic. They're basically, the preoptic and the supraoptic are related to eyesight. But they basically control also homeostasis, bodily functions, temperature, hormones, emotions, behaviors, thirst, hunger, your circadian rhythms, big sleep patterns, and other types of patterns that you may have. For instance, you may notice in different times of the year, pattern gets adjusted. But you're used to a particular amount of light when you wake up, or a particular amount of light when you want to fall asleep. Yes, Chris?
To what extent is it emotional and behavioral patterns? When you
What's
say, to what extent is it emotional and behavioral patterns? Like what kind of patterns is it referring to?
Well, you'll notice that when you actually, it's basically affecting it. So when we're looking at the hypothalamus, for instance, you actually have in your hypothalamus, it relates, it also connects up with your pituitary. Your anterior pituitary actually releases things like follicle stimulating hormone and luteinizing hormone, which actually affects certain other organs in the body, which releases then other hormones like testosterone or estrogen or such. And a lot of times they may affect emotions.
So when it says hormones
Yeah.
above it, it's kind of the same thing.
Yeah.
That's what threw me off. Like
That's what
there's
you're talking
another
about.
function of behavioral patterns besides this, the controlling of hormones, the influence of hormones. So that's just two things.
That's two
Same
things.
thing, okay.
Yeah, okay. So, and your hypothalamus looks like this. So when we're looking at the hypothalamus, this is basically your hypothalamus, which connects up with your pituitary. And we basically have the anterior and the posterior pituitary.
So if I'm looking at this, it's pituitary and thalamus.
Yes. Okay. And you actually have different regions of this. You also have an olfactory region. You have, and a lot of it is homeostasis, is what's controlled here
In the hypothalamus?
in the hypothalamus.
I thought that was the one sensory that doesn't receive from.
That was
That was
That's
the
the
thalamus?
thalamus,
Oh, so
not the hypothalamus. Okay. Okay, but you do get, think messages from skeletal muscles, visceral muscles, taste, smell, hearing, temperature. So you're getting all these messages and then you readjust. Okay? I did mention there are a couple other minor portions or subcategories that we're going to talk about real briefly in the diencephalon. One of them is known as the epithalamus. Epithalamus is on the edge of, basically. This is where we actually have the pineal gland, and the pineal gland is where you produce melatonin, which is related to sleep habits. Okay? So it actually affects your sleep-wake pattern daily. And if you have a change to that, it will offset it. For instance, I know my son, he never established a nice pattern. I can tell you that much because I remember last week he woke us up at 3 o'clock in the morning to watch TV. And he woke us up to make sure that we watched TV with him. And he was there for about 15-20 minutes and then dozed off. So we could go back to sleep. But sometimes he's woken up at 3 or 4 in the morning and kept one of us up or both of us up until about 6. It's the benefits and responsibilities of it. I'll say it that way. We also have the the Herbern nuclei, which is basically involved with olfactory. Emotions. One of the strongest emotions you actually get is olfactory.
Yeah.
Did you guys know that?
Yes. Yes. That's pretty cool.
Believe it or not, most major events you have in your life, a lot of it coordinates with food. And food has odors. And you may actually have deep-seated memories based on those odors, which you may not even realize. So if you're used to happy occurrences where you have a particular odor, when you smell that odor, you may actually get more emotionally happy over it. Or otherwise, depending on what type of emotion was related to that odor. So it does play a significant role in how you feel. For instance, you may smell a particular flower. You guys like flowers? Anybody like flowers in here?
I love flowers.
You love flowers? That's nice.
Thank you.
You know,
Thank you.
they're nice and colorful. That's how I look at them. My wife loves flowers. Okay. But, you know, certain flowers may also imply that. For instance, do you ever, if you go on a interaction, on a date or anything like that, sometimes if something's coordinated with it, with an odor, you may it may trigger a memory in the future or maybe in the past based on that odor experience. But odors are very, very strong. Very, very strong. Okay, as far as emotions. And your epithalamus, guess where it is? There's the pineal gland, and that's the epithalamus right there. Okay, that line. Okay, and that little circle, that's their pineal gland, which releases the melatonin. So it's only about the size of a pea. Okay. We also have what's called the subthalamus, and this has tracks where we actually have motor connections. We do actually have the red nucleus, substantia nigra, also connecting with the basal ganglia. The basal ganglia, like I said, because it's really close to that red nuclei, that's where we actually can have any kind of infectious agent that can actually infect the brain, gets in and causes damage. That's why when we look at rabies, we look at the basal ganglia. Like I said, when we actually have animals and they get rabies, to check it out, we have to cut off its head to get at the basal ganglia. But that's the reality of what the state's Department of Health would do to verify. Okay. That's also where things like syphilis invades the body when it gets into the brain and causes its problems. Like alcohol. What's that?
In the subthalamus.
In the subthalamus, specifically at the red nuclei that connects up to the basal ganglia area. Okay.
Parkinson also.
What's that?
Parkinson.
Parkinson's, yes. Parkinson's also is affected at the basal ganglia. The basal ganglia will actually, one of the interesting things about it, it has, it does get the messages sent out to the cerebellum and triggers the different muscles. But this is also where dopamine may affect it and is not controlled, so it actually has inhibitory, it should have inhibitory functions to actually control the muscle coordination and muscle contractions. But a lot of times with Parkinson's, it doesn't. It doesn't have that inhibitory effect. And that's why a lot of times with Parkinson's, you actually have uncontrolled muscle contractions or impulse contractions, which are not controlled. So. You guys like the diencephalon so far? We also have what's called the circumventricular organs.
That's it.
Yeah. They basically monitor the blood-brain barrier, basically. And are involved in homeostatic events with the endocrine system and the nervous system. This is where HIV actually likes to invade. So that's basically our subconscious brain. Now there's one slide left on this particular PowerPoint, which is this one, which just tells you about the cerebrum. The cerebrum is basically the largest part of the brain. It has two hemispheres, the left and the right. The outermost portion is 2 to 4 millimeters thick, and that's why it has gray matter, so that's why it's usually referred to the brain as being gray matter, or the cerebral cortex. That's where we actually have, of course, unmyelinated fibers, so it's slower, but they actually have a lot of the memories and things like that that we have. It's the inner layers that we actually see white matter more, myelinated. We do actually have different types of indents, I'll call it. We have gyri, we have fissures, and we have sulci.
Only in the cerebrum, or is this just like within
This is in the cerebrum. That means gyri and fissures would be basically the deepest. Sulci are not as deep. They are, and I want you to realize when we do produce our brain, brain tissue is the first tissue formed in our body as to create an organ. And it starts off as basically a tube of nerve tissue, which then eventually starts folding on itself and produces these different folds that if we were to look at the brain before it happened and how big it would be if it did not have these folds, it would be more like this big, your brain, without any folds. But because we have the folds, we're able to fit into a smaller space. Anybody ever see Mars Attacks? The movie, Mars Attacks. Mars Attacks, you'll see the brains of the Martians. I'll just say it that way. Okay? One of the interesting things that you'll see is one of the fissures that actually is there. It actually connects the left hemisphere with the right hemisphere. And at that point, we actually have what's called the it's called the corpus callosum. I don't know. I'm looking at it right there, and I'm not even reading it. Corpus callosum. Now, if you were to look at the corpus callosum, let's see if I can pull up that slide, which actually shows the brain. Right here. This is this connection right here, where we actually connect the two hemispheres of the cerebrum, the corpus callosum. One of the things that was done years ago, which I didn't talk about, but I might as well at this point. Do you remember we talked about epilepsy? One of the things that they used to do to actually try to reduce and it is white fibers and white matter, to connect the left hemisphere to the right hemisphere. One of the things they did was they used to cut it. for epileptics, separated, which is known as a lobotomy, a frontal lobotomy. And they did that mainly because they thought, well, if the brain has uncontrolled muscular contractions or activity, because it has more brain activity than it should with an epileptic at that time during its seizure, that if we actually separate it, maybe what will happen is we'll have reduced amount of brain activity and it'll actually, not have many problems. Unfortunately, they found out the hard way that epileptics, or people in general, when you separate the two halves of the brain, two hemispheres, you have certain thoughts which may be more related to logic, and the other may be more space orientation, or in other words, what I'm going to say is one side is more recognizing symbols and letters, and the other side is understanding what those mean. So what happened was with epileptics, when they did the lobotomy, it actually caused more confusion for the individual because they weren't able to communicate one side of the brain with the other. So they stopped doing that for the most part. Okay. So, why don't you put your brains away, model-wise, and continue upstairs.
Is there a metal piano?
Not that I see it here.
Damn it! Actually, thanks. I have to stop that.